Have you ever been underestimated or judged based on your appearance, background, or something entirely beyond your control? What happens when someone believes they can look down on you, but it turns out they're the ones in for a huge surprise? This is the story of Victoria Bennett, a woman who defied every stereotype, and the luxury car dealer who laughed at the wrong person. The soft hum of the city outside blended with the quiet clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation inside the luxurious Elite Motors showroom. It was an exclusive world, a space where only the most refined and privileged gathered. The scent of leather and polished metal filled the air, with rows of high-end vehicles glistening under the showroom lights like precious artifacts on display. Every corner of the space screamed affluence. Victoria Bennett stepped through the glass doors with quiet confidence, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Her dark skin gleamed against the rich tones of her sleek gown, and despite her understated elegance, her presence cut through the room like a blade. The showroom was filled with a mixture of wealthy men, some older, others slightly younger, all draped in expensive suits and accompanied by women whose ages varied just as widely. Their voices were hushed, as if the space itself demanded reverence. Victoria wasn't fazed. She knew the game. She had played it many times before, though never in a place like this. The cars around her were nothing more than symbols of success, of wealth, and of the barriers that often come with those symbols. Behind the counter, Blake Thompson, the dealership owner, stood with his arms crossed, chatting casually with one of his employees. His sharp suit and slicked-back hair spoke volumes about his place in the social hierarchy of luxury car sales. But when his eyes flicked toward Victoria, they barely registered her presence. His conversation with the salesman continued uninterrupted, his booming laughter echoing across the showroom. To him, Victoria was just another visitor, another face passing through the revolving doors. He made no effort to acknowledge her, no effort to engage. Victoria, however, was accustomed to this. She had walked into many rooms where people didn't expect her to be there. It didn't bother her. She wasn't looking for validation or approval. She was here for something much more important. Her eyes landed on the silver Aston Martin Vantage, its curves reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights in a dance of glinting chrome. The vehicle was a work of art, a masterpiece of engineering and craftsmanship. But more than that, it was a status symbol, a statement of who could afford to own such a machine. As she stood before it, Victoria felt the weight of those unspoken rules, the invisible boundaries she would have to cross to gain entry into this exclusive world. She approached the car slowly, her fingers grazing its smooth surface. The dealer, Blake, noticed her movement, but rather than offering assistance, he let out another loud, amused chuckle with his colleague, clearly unbothered by her presence. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice steady but carrying across the showroom. She was used to being the only woman in the room, often the only person of color, yet there was a quiet confidence in her tone that demanded attention. "I'd like to know more about this model." Blake paused mid-sentence, his eyes scanning her figure with a barely concealed sneer. His gaze was quick, dismissive. He did not give her the same respect he would offer one of his regular clients, dressed in sharp suits and carrying a polished air of privilege. He sized her up, too quickly, and then replied with an edge of disdain in his voice. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable over at our used car location across town. This particular model is for a different kind of clientele." The words stung, but Victoria didn't flinch. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some curious, others dismissive, yet she stood her ground. "I'm very familiar with the Aston Martin Vantage," she said. Her voice was composed, almost too composed. She could feel the smirk tug at the corners of Blake's mouth, but she continued. "I'd like to know about the performance specifications and the customization options." Blake laughed again, loudly this time, and the sound was harsh, derisive. "Ma'am," he said, the words dripping with mockery, This car costs more than most people make in 5 years. Are you sure you want to waste your time here?" A ripple of quiet laughter ran through the showroom as the men who had been watching the exchange nodded to each other, exchanging knowing glances. Victoria's back straightened, but she didn't let their sneers unnerve her. "You're wasting my time right now," she shot back, her voice calm but firm. The words hung in the air for a brief moment. She could feel the shift. She could feel the tension rising. Some of the onlookers were beginning to realize that this wasn't a typical interaction. Blake's smile faltered, just a little. He turned to face her fully now, his arrogance no longer as assured. But his tone, when he spoke again, was sharp. "We have certain standards here at Elite Motors. I'm sure you understand." His gaze swept toward the door as if dismissing her, but he stepped forward to block her path. "Perhaps you should leave before this gets uncomfortable for everyone." Victoria did not move. Her posture was unwavering, and the quiet strength she exuded became more pronounced. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said, making it clear that this was no ordinary request. It was a calculated maneuver. She knew exactly what would come next. It was time for Blake to reveal the full extent of his prejudices. Blake's face turned a shade darker as his pride took a hit. He puffed out his chest, his words sharp and defensive. "I own this dealership," he snapped, his voice hardening, "and I'm asking you to leave." Victoria remained rooted to the spot. The handcuffs came quickly after that. 2 security guards appeared at his command. Blake's voice escalated further, now tinged with the panic of someone who had just overstepped. He reached for his phone as if the simple act of calling the police would resolve the situation. "I'm calling the police," he shouted. "We don't need your kind causing trouble here." The final insult cut through the air like a knife. Blake had exposed his true colors. He wasn't just rejecting a customer, he was rejecting the very idea that someone like Victoria could belong in this world at all. And his belief in that superiority was about to cost him dearly. The sun was setting behind the tall city buildings, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. Victoria, barely a teenager, stood at the edge of the old town square, gazing at the bustling scene in front of her. People moved quickly, some rushing to finish their errands, while others seemed to be taking their time, chatting and laughing. Victoria had always felt like an outsider in this town. She was new here, having just moved with her family a few months ago. The first few weeks had been overwhelming. The unfamiliar faces, the constant noise of the city, and the feeling of being so small in such a big place. But today was different. Today she felt something shifting inside her. It was as if the city was no longer a stranger, but something she could finally begin to understand. Victoria's first real challenge came when she decided to join a local art class. She had always enjoyed drawing, but the idea of presenting her work in front of strangers made her nervous. On the first day, she walked into the classroom with shaky hands, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. The room was full of people already chatting with each other. Some were sharing their work, while others were laughing at something one of their friends had said. Victoria hesitated at the door. "Come on in," a voice called from across the room. It was Mrs. Monroe, the teacher. She was an older woman with bright glasses and a warm smile. Her presence instantly put Victoria at ease. "We're just getting started. Grab a seat and make yourself comfortable." Victoria walked over and sat down at an empty desk, her heart still racing. As the lesson began, she noticed that the other students were much more confident than she was. They sketched with ease, their pencils moving quickly across the paper. Victoria, on the other hand, struggled to make her lines straight, and her shading seemed all wrong. But Mrs. Monroe's encouraging words kept her going. "It's all about finding your style," she said. "Don't worry about being perfect. Just let the pencil move." By the end of the class, Victoria had filled the page with a half-finished sketch. But for the first time in weeks, she felt proud. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. As the weeks went by, Victoria became more comfortable with the class. She even started to make friends. One of them was Emma, a lively girl who shared a love for drawing. They would often stay after class, sketching together and discussing their favorite artists. "Have you ever been to the old library?" Emma asked one day as they were putting away their art supplies. Victoria shook her head. "I've heard about it, but I've never been." "It's amazing," Emma said. "There's this huge section filled with art books. You should come with me this weekend. We can spend hours there, just looking through them." Victoria smiled. "I'd love that." The trip to the library was the beginning of a deep friendship between Victoria and Emma. They spent many weekends together, exploring the city and sharing their thoughts on art, life, and their dreams for the future. With Emma by her side, Victoria no longer felt alone. One afternoon during their usual hangout at the library, Victoria came across a book about famous artists. As she flipped through the pages, one particular painting caught her eye. It was an abstract piece, with bold colors and wild shapes that seemed to tell a story. She felt an instant connection to the painting, as if it was speaking to her. Something clicked in her mind. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is what I want to do. I want to create art that speaks to people like this." Victoria's journey as an artist had only just begun, but in that moment she knew she had found her calling. As the months passed, Victoria's skills improved. She began to experiment with different styles and mediums, always pushing herself to create something new. Her confidence grew, not just in her art, but in herself. She no longer felt like an outsider in the city. She had found her place, her purpose. One day, while walking home from class, she received a call from Mrs. Monroe. "Victoria, I have some exciting news. There's going to be an art exhibition next month, and I'd love for you to showcase your work." Victoria's heart raced. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Absolutely," Mrs. Monroe replied. "Your art is unique, and I believe it deserves to be seen." That night, Victoria stayed up late working on a new piece. She poured all her emotions into it, her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. The painting was a reflection of everything she had been through, and it felt like the culmination of her artistic journey. When the exhibition finally came, Victoria stood in front of her painting, surrounded by strangers who admired her work. For the first time in her life, she felt truly proud of what she had accomplished. As she looked around the gallery, she realized something important. The city was no longer a strange place to her. It was her home now, and as she moved forward, she knew that her journey was far from over. The police station was quiet, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above Victoria's head as she sat in the metal chair, the cuffs biting into her wrists. The room around her felt surreal. This was not where she had imagined her day ending. Her eyes wandered, taking in the plain walls and the indifferent officers moving through the space. Yet, amidst the cold surroundings, she remained remarkably composed. Victoria was no stranger to adversity. Throughout her life, she had faced countless challenges, each one a test of her strength and determination. But today, this moment felt different. This wasn't a meeting in a boardroom or a challenging negotiation over a high-stakes deal. No, this was personal. Her thoughts drifted to Marcus. He had always been the reason she pushed forward, the light in her life when the world seemed dark. Raising him alone after the death of her husband had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. But it had also been her greatest motivation. Every decision she made, every step she took, was with him in mind. She had worked tirelessly to create a future where he wouldn't face the same barriers she had, the same struggles she had endured. Victoria thought about the way Blake Thompson had looked at her in the dealership earlier that day. The disdain in his eyes. The way he had tried to belittle her for simply walking into his showroom, dressed in an elegant gown, a woman of power and presence. She was used to being underestimated, but Blake's attitude, his arrogance, was on another level. And as she had stood there in the showroom hearing his condescending remarks, she knew this wasn't just about a car. It was about something far deeper. It was about the unspoken biases that still pervaded the most exclusive corners of society. The sound of the door opening snapped her back to the present, Two officers entered. Their expressions were neutral but firm. One of them handed her a piece of paper, an official document, likely a form of processing or arrest notice. But she didn't care about that. She didn't care about the details. What mattered was the way this moment would change things. How her fight in that dealership, the humiliation she'd endured, would lead to a greater purpose. As she was processed and the cold metal handcuffs were removed, her mind already began to formulate a plan. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. She had been humiliated, yes, but there were countless others out there, people of color, women, anyone who had been treated unjustly in spaces where they had a right to be. This was about them. This was about ensuring that no one else would experience the kind of bias Blake Thompson had shown her. Her cell phone buzzed as the officer handed it to her. It was a message from Marcus, a short text, just 2 words. "On my way." Victoria couldn't help but smile. She knew exactly what was coming. Marcus was no stranger to fighting for justice. As a lawyer, he had made a name for himself in corporate law, focusing on cases that brought real change. He had inherited her determination, her ability to turn challenges into opportunities. The two of them, working together, would make sure this moment would not be forgotten. Minutes later, the door to the station opened again, and Marcus stepped inside. His tall, confident figure was instantly recognizable. He didn't waste any time. His gaze was sharp, focused, as he walked toward her, a briefcase in hand. "Mom, you all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low but steady. Victoria nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. "I'll be fine. I just want to get this over with." "I'll take care of everything from here," Marcus said with certainty. He turned to the officer and handed over a piece of paper, a legal document. Victoria couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she watched her son handle the situation with the same calm determination that had defined her own life. As they left the station, Marcus slipped his arm around her shoulders. "We've got this," he said. Victoria glanced up at him, her heart full. This wasn't just a fight for herself. It was a fight for something larger, for every woman who had been overlooked, for every person of color who had been unjustly dismissed. This was their moment. Blake Thompson sat behind his desk, reviewing the dealership's latest figures, his mind wandering as he ran his fingers over the smooth surface of his desk. He barely glanced up when his assistant knocked and stepped into his office. "Mr. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. He says he has an appointment." Blake wasn't expecting anyone, but when he heard the name, his heart dropped. "Marcus Bennett?" He nodded and gestured for the assistant to let him in. As the door opened, Marcus stepped into the room, a towering figure of confidence and purpose. Blake felt a chill creep down his spine as Marcus approached his desk, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Mr. Thompson?" Marcus said smoothly, extending his hand. "I believe you've met my mother, Victoria Bennett, the woman you had arrested last week for attempting to purchase an Aston Martin." Blake's blood ran cold as the recognition hit him. The events of that day played out in his mind, the laughter, the insults, the belittling. His stomach churned. He had misjudged her, and now he was about to pay the price. I didn't know," Blake stammered, his voice faltering. "I didn't realize—" Marcus didn't allow him to finish. "You didn't realize you were dealing with the CEO of Bennett Financial Group, a woman who has spent decades building an empire, a woman who doesn't tolerate injustice?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm here to make sure you understand just how much of a mistake you've made." Marcus placed a legal document on the desk, papers Blake couldn't ignore. "This is a formal notice of legal action for discrimination, false imprisonment, and defamation. It's not just about one woman, Mr. Thompson. This is about your pattern of behavior. It's about holding you accountable." Blake's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. His mind raced, but his words came out in a panicked rush. "We can fix this. There's got to be a way. I never meant for it to go this far." Marcus's eyes were cold. "The time for excuses has passed, Mr. Thompson. It's too late for apologies." Blake's chest tightened as Marcus stood to leave, his last words echoing in the silence of the room. The consequences will be swift and irreversible. You'll hear from the board and from my lawyers." With that, Marcus turned and walked out, leaving Blake to face the weight of his arrogance. 1 week later, Blake Thompson sat alone in his office, reading through an avalanche of legal notices, his mind still reeling from Marcus's visit. The walls seemed to close in around him as the reality of his situation settled in. His empire, built on privilege and discrimination, was crumbling. Meanwhile, Victoria Bennett stood on the balcony of her penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The legal action had stirred a nationwide conversation about discrimination in luxury retail. People had rallied behind her, sharing their stories of being overlooked, ridiculed, and unjustly treated. Victoria's victory wasn't just her own. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or belittled. It was about showing the world that no matter how much money or power someone had, prejudice could and would be challenged. She had taught Marcus well, not just about business, but about the strength it took to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Together, they had turned Blake Thompson's mistakes into a powerful reminder of what happens when injustice meets its match. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.